Most of us are familiar with the traditions of scary stories. Usually while gathered around a campfire, people will swap spooky tales about things that go bump in the night. These deliciously frightful stories were just enough to scare you without totally pushing you over the edge. But what happens when scary stuff starts happening in real life? Tonight I've gathered some real-life horror stories from the internet. So, whether you prefer paranormal activity or tales of adventurers who barely escape death's grasp, these real horror stories will make your skin crawl, and at the very least, rob you of some much-deserved, if not all, sleep. So dim the lights, curl up under your favorite blanket, and let's begin. I'm from Indiana, and a couple years back, my mother was driving my sister and I to school. To set the stage, it was a foggy morning, and it was on a stretch of road with a forest on one side and a cornfield on the other. Out of the blue, this creature that we couldn't identify ran across the road, causing my mom to slam on the brakes. It looked about the size of a grown man and was covered in dark hair. It was bipedal, but it was loping really oddly. Needless to say, it wasn't a coyote, and I've never heard of bears being in central Indiana. Admittedly, it was foggy, so I could have misidentified it. So this happened a long time ago. I must have been at least 18, no older than 20. I was sleeping on my back in my bed in my parents' house where I lived, when I suddenly woke up from a deep, dreamless sleep. I opened my eyes, and a male, humanoid shadow seemed like it pushed itself up from laying on top of me. It seemed surprised that I woke up, interrupting whatever it was doing. It wasn't anything sexual. If anything, it was, well, I'm not sure how to describe it. Feeding or scanning me? Makes the most sense. I know both of those are sort of at odds with each other. It swooped back at me in a rush, and I fell back asleep instantly. I woke up about 2 hours later than my normal wake-up time, and I felt okay, just a little sluggish. I never saw it again. I've never had an experience myself, but I do believe in this and similar phenomena. I have never spoken with my boyfriend about this subreddit, unknown humanoids, or any paranormal occurrences for that matter. On Friday night, he and I were at a friend's house and decided to leave at 1 a.m. It's very foggy outside, being that we live near a river and creeks in a rural Illinois. He goes to the gas station on his way home to the rural town where we both live, about a block away from each other. I get home and I don't hear from him for quite a while, until he calls me, very shaken up and crying. He says on his drive home, he saw something crouched in the road on the right side. It looked to be fairly small, possibly a child. He rolled his window down and asked if they were okay, and got no answer. The thing only continued sobbing. He pulls over and gets out of the car, walks up to whatever this was, and attempted to ask if it needed any help. The thing stands up on 2 feet, and is now 6 feet tall, and lets out a god-awful screech, and it runs off the road into the dense woods, near the Kaskaskia River. He can't say it was a boy or a girl, but he can say he never saw anything like that before. He's pretty jarred by the whole experience. I don't remember it completely, but my grandpa once told us a story about an experience he had while he used to live in a small ranch in Mexico. He was with his older brother, so I think my grandfather was about 12 or 14 at the time, and while he was with his brother out in the ranch, they heard something behind some bushes, and he said it sounded like singing. He and his brother both went to investigate it, and when they looked behind the bush, they saw a couple of little people. Duende is what they call them in Mexico. They didn't see my grandpa or his brother, and his brother suggested that they both get out of there before they were seen. They returned home, and I'm not sure if they ever saw them again after that. An investigation/shamanic group on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, the Okalala, Lakota, South Dakota, was called in to investigate and bless a home. The incidents began when two sisters observed a black-eyed boy outside the home. Not long after, a group of ashen, white-skinned children with black eyes were seen, congregating around the property, in an attempt to interact with other children living there. The first two occasions, there were only two of them, and they asked to be let inside the house to get food. The third time, a third one showed up, and this time they asked for blood. They were never granted access to the house. The children described their voices as not normal, robotic and monotone. Pets also went missing around this time, around the property. The parents of the children recalled seeing these spooky children as well. They also claimed to have noticed strange events around their home, including poltergeist activity and the sighting of, on at least 2 occasions, strange entities that they later thought to be an alien. When I was camping with my family several years ago, my father and I went walking in the dark with a flashlight when we heard a kind of chirping noise, like a person doing a crappy imitation of a bird call. We stopped and shined our flashlight around, and then up into the trees. The beam landed on something, maybe 3 feet tall, standing up. A humanoid crouching with its hands holding onto the branches. It was hairless and very pale-skinned, pretty much white. Its head was abnormally large, with 2 huge eyes and bat-like ears. We only saw it for a split second because my dad jerked the flashlight away when he first saw it. And when we tried to find it again with the flashlight, it was gone without a trace. I asked my dad if he had seen that, and he had. We were both very perplexed by it. When I've told other people this story, they speculate that it could have been an owl or some other animal. But my dad and I are both fairly experienced outdoors and sportsmen, and we've never seen anything that looked like that before or since. I went back and double-checked with my mother, and she's fairly certain this took place at a campground near Stanley, Idaho, at Lola Creek Campground. She also told me that we left early because there was something moving around the campsite at night that spooked my dad, which I only learned just now. We moved into a new house a few months ago. As we were in the process of purchasing the new house, the renter who was living in it died unexpectedly of natural causes in his mid-40s. He died right in the middle of the living room. Shortly after, we moved into the house, and almost immediately, our 2-year-old daughter starts talking about the ghost that lives in our house. Now, let's be real here. She's 2, and 2-year-olds are very impressionable. Halloween had recently passed, and she had this Halloween-themed picture book that she loved to read. So it's entirely possible that all this talk of ghosts was just coming from looking through this book on a regular basis. Still, she was always telling me that the ghost was in her playhouse in the basement, or that the ghost was on the stairs, or that the ghost was standing in the corner. She never seemed to be afraid of the ghost, and considered him to be her friend, so I wasn't at all concerned, even if there really was a ghost haunting our house. If he's a nice and helpful ghost, it could certainly be a lot worse. I would often tell the ghost that he was welcome to stay if he wanted to, but he was also welcome to go if that would make him happier. I was about 30-70 on the ghost being real, and she could see and talk to him, versus the ghost being just her imagination, fueled by her Halloween book. Until one day, when we were going out to the car to go to daycare in the morning. It was still dark out and raining. My daughter told me that the ghost was on the back deck, and then she told me that day was the ghost's birthday, and she wanted to sing him happy birthday. Once again, I mostly disregarded what she was saying, as she is birthday obsessed and has in the past made us sing happy birthday to Mickey Mouse, a bowl of fruit snacks, and the bathroom. So we sang and wished the ghost a happy birthday and went on with our lives. Later that day, out of pure curiosity, I looked up the obituary of the man who had died in our house. And wouldn't you know it, it was his frickin' birthday. A few years ago, I was living in a fairly nice apartment complex. I was having a cigarette on my balcony around 3 a.m. on a Tuesday night. I'm usually on my phone, but I got this weird chill and looked up to see a middle-aged man walking down the sidewalk across the complex. It struck me that he did not belong here, and I realized he wasn't one of the residents. As I was thinking this, he suddenly stopped and looked right at me, making eerie, way too long eye contact, and then rushed off between the buildings in the opposite direction of the apartment. I told my husband about it, and I joked that if we get a knock on our door in the next 15 minutes, we can assume it's that creeper. Oh my gosh, sure as crap, 10 minutes later, there's this quiet, faint tap, tap, tap on our door. My eyes probably popped out of my head, and my husband jumped up to grab his gun from the other room. I slowly walk up to the door to look through the peephole, holding my breath, and there was the man I had seen looking right at me through the peephole. I know he wasn't able to actually see me, but the image of him looking right into my eye still freaks me out to this day. My husband walked up to the door, staring through the peephole, and shouted, "What?" in this threatening voice. Apparently the man had his hand on the doorknob and jerked back in surprise to hear a man's voice. Dude asked for Jeremy or some made-up name, and my husband told him to leave. After BSing a little longer, the guy finally walked downstairs, only to peer up into the living room window from the lawn. I closed the blinds, and he moved over to stare at me through the balcony door. He didn't move on until after I shut that one too. We called security and gave a clear description and everything. A few days later, we got a report from our complex that an apartment had been robbed around the same time that night. What keeps me up at night is this question. If you're going to rob an apartment, why would you go to one that you definitely know a woman is awake and home, seemingly alone at? My bedroom is on the second floor of the house. There's no patio, porch, or overhang of any kind beneath my windows. A couple of years ago, I was watching TV in bed around 2 a.m. and heard a louder than usual animal sound. Not uncommon to hear squirrels running around on the roof from time to time. Didn't think much of it, but it kept on happening, and it started to sound awfully close to the window and not on the roof. I ignored it for a pretty long time. After at least 40 to 45 minutes of being irritated by the noise, I banged on the wall in hopes that this would scare them off so I could get some sleep. Just 2 quick bangs with my fist, which were answered with 2 bangs on the wall right next to the window from outside. Needless to say, I just about crapped and jumped out of bed. Now, my living room has a bay window and is on the other end of the house, so I could look out that window from the side and see my bedroom window. I hustled downstairs and peeked out. I see a guy standing in front of my house, below my bedroom window. He's got a knife, a small pocket knife, in his hand, and he's petting the front of my house. So I call the police and wait. He never leaves the front of the house, even when they roll up and ultimately disarm and arrest him without much struggle. I once woke up with the outline of a handprint on my chest. I measured it, and it was way too large to be my handprint, and way too small to be my husband's hand. Occasionally, I get mild bouts of insomnia, but nothing serious. Usually just a delay in my bedtime of exactly 2 or 3 hours. One night, I suddenly just cannot sleep. Nothing could get me to relax, and I eventually gave up and just sat in the front room playing Heavy Rain all night, as it had just come out a few weeks ago. The next day, when I headed off to work exhausted with 0 hours of sleep, I get a text from my roommate. "Dude, the police are all over the apartment complex." Apparently, 9 apartments, including our downstairs neighbor, were broken into last night, with people home sleeping. Some people even reported things being stolen from rooms they were sleeping in. It hit me that if I had not stayed up all night and left the light on in the front room, I would have been robbed, or worse. I drove past a car on my way to class. I was going to college at the time. I always took the back roads to avoid traffic, so I thought it was a bit odd to have a car parked on the side of the road. When I came back from class, it was still there. I drove by a bit more slowly and saw what I thought was someone sleeping in there. I thought that was odder still, but maybe someone was traveling and decided to pull off and take a rest and just fell asleep longer than they planned? Nope. Next morning, I read in the paper, a wife killed her husband and dumped his body and the car on that back road. All of the alarms in my house went off at exactly midnight. Then later in the night, all of the phones in my house began to ring at exactly 3 a.m. I watched The Babadook the day before with my boyfriend, and needless to say, I was freaked out. A few days ago, my iPhone would not accept my fingerprint for Touch ID, any of my fingerprints. My dog stayed on the other side of the apartment from me and wouldn't take any treats from me. I trained him not to take treats from anyone except me, to avoid poisoning or illness, but he wouldn't even take his favorite treats from me or cuddle with me. When I went to hug him, he hid in his kennel. The PIN didn't work for my debit card, so I ended up having to run it as a credit. I used the same PIN for everything. The only websites I could get into were Reddit, Gmail, and Amazon. Pages where my password was stored. Any websites where I had to enter the username and password, it came back as incorrect. Thank goodness there's no password to wake my computer up, or I wouldn't have been able to do any work that day. The next day, everything was back to normal. "911 dispatcher, I got a call from a house. I called it back, and it had been disconnected. This is actually fairly common and happened whenever it rained. The backstory on the house is that it was vacant and used to have an active landline. The theory was that water was somehow getting into the telephone system to the house. and was setting off false alarms. Well, we get one, and I thought about just saying, "Up yours!" But I stuck with the protocol and sent an officer. The vacant house had just caught on fire the day after a rainstorm. Never found a witness, and the house was saved. When I was in 5th grade, some guy who was mentally ill had a meltdown somewhere in Chicago. Apparently, he shot and killed some random guy and stole his car. He drove up I-94 towards my suburb, got off the highway, and drove straight into my neighborhood. It's very close to the exit, and just started shooting sporadically at people's houses. He somehow wound up in my backyard, which is full of trees, and was just shooting in every direction. I can still vividly remember brake lights in the middle of the otherwise pitch black woods and sparks from the gunfire going off in every direction. The cops show up and shot him to death. Luckily no one was hurt, but my neighbors did find bullets in the middle of their mattress. Fireworks are not so much fun anymore. Number 1. One time, I woke up hearing my sister's doll say, "Let's play." But I blew it off. I thought maybe my dog stepped on the doll's hand, and that's why I heard it. So I turned to my opposite side and awoke a few minutes later and saw a dark shadow at the foot of my bed. And when I tried to focus to see if it was my brother or my mom, my bed started shaking. I quite literally covered my head with my blanket and told my mom the next morning. She proceeded to place the holy water next to my bed, and it never happened again. My husband's family has always told me about their house being haunted. I never, ever once believed any of it. I just wrote it off as them being superstitious. Well, a few months back, me, my husband, and my daughter spent the night at my in-laws. I slept in my sister-in-law's room with my daughter, and my husband and his sister ended up crashing on the couch in the living room watching TV. Late at night, I heard the door open, and I heard little puppy feet walking in and around the room. I felt my sister-in-law's puppy tug at the blanket, and I heard it scratch the bed trying to jump up. I pulled the blanket away and heard him leave. I then texted my husband to come and take the dog outside because I didn't want it to jump on the bed and get scared or have my daughter getting scared. I heard my husband walk back and forth down the hallway. He came back into the room to tell me it was already outside. I thought he was messing with me, so I rolled my eyes and fell back to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, he told me about turning off lights and finding them turned back on. I always believe there's a logical explanation for everything, but I just haven't found anything that makes more sense than the house ghost finally accepting me into the family, enough to haunt me too. I still remember this as clear as day. When I was 3, I got up in the middle of the night to sleep in my mom's room. As I crawled in next to her, I looked towards the foot of our bed. There stood the silhouettes of 2 grown men. One had glowing red eyes, and the other had glowing yellow eyes. Both just stood there and stared at me. I assumed I was seeing things, and I rubbed my eyes repeatedly, but they were still there. I begged my mom to wake up and look, but she kept her eyes closed and kept telling me it was just a dream. She remembers this too. She says at first she was just groggy and really thought I was dreaming, but after I kept waking her up, she realized how serious I was, and I was too afraid to look. Finally, in sheer terror, I got up and ran back to my bedroom. Years later, we looked it up. Apparently, these are commonly seen paranormal entities known as shadow people. silhouettes with glowing red or yellow eyes. Still chills my mom and I to the bone. When my boyfriend was a teenager, he went to a party across the street at one of his neighbors' houses. His parents and siblings stayed, but he headed home early to go to bed since he was so tired. He climbed into bed, door closed, lights off. But just when he was about to doze off, someone or something grabbed his ankles. He said he felt it clear as day, like it wasn't a light touch. Something grabbed him. So of course he jumped out of bed and turned the lights on, but no one was there. He thought maybe his brother or sister had come home to prank him, but he looked everywhere, under the bed, in the closet, the rest of the house, and couldn't find anyone hiding anywhere. And there was no way someone would have even had time to hide since he got up so quickly. He was so scared he ran across the street, back to the party. He ended up sleeping in his parents' room that night. One time I was lying in bed, and it was about 1 a.m. I heard someone walking down the hallway right outside my room, and then my door started to creak open. I thought it was my stepfather, since he usually messes with me like that, and the door stopped after a couple of inches. Through the crack, I could see an eye staring right back at me. I shouted at him that I could see him, and I thought at that point he would give up messing with me. After that, the door slammed shut, and there was a loud footsteps down the hall, the opposite way of my parents' room. When I went out in the hall to see why he was acting so weird, I saw my parents' door was closed, and my parents were dead asleep. When I asked about it in the morning, they checked the cameras that we kept in the hall, and the data from the night before was completely corrupted. I went ghost hunting with my ex-boyfriend and 2 of his friends at the West Virginia State Prison last summer. We were on the solitary floor in the cell of one of the most brutal killers the prison held. My ex was holding a tape recorder, and I was holding an EMF detector, which only seemed to light up when I asked the questions. My friend asked the ghost, "Do you like the pretty girl who's asking you the questions?" And the EMF detector flashed bright red for a few seconds. After a few more minutes of questioning, we asked the spirit if it wanted us to leave. Once we left the cell, we replayed the tape recorder, and after the question about us leaving was posed, you could hear a faint, "Yeah, good night." Our family made an annual tradition of attending a pre-Christmas event held at a local church. It was a cross between a craft fair and a garage sale. One section was dubbed the Nostalgia Room, where antiques were sold, and it was there that we bought a small, wall-hanging grandfather clock. This clock was haunted. My dad would forget to wind it, but it would still chime on the correct hour even when the hands and pendulum had stopped. Lights flickered at random times or turned on in the middle of the night while the switches remained in the off position. We moved out of state, unrelated to the spookiness, and brought the clock with us. The new house also had some minor strange occurrences. One night my sister and I were alone in the new house while my parents were out of state on business. We were watching a scary movie, and that dang clock chimed, effectively spooking us. We took it off the wall, into the garage, and smashed it into pieces with a hammer. Flash forward to hours later that night, when we were falling asleep, only to hear that now smashed clock chiming continuously from the garage. We opened the door and stared in horror at the pile of glass and gears as it continued to chime. We swept the mess into a garbage bag, drove to the nearest church, found the dumpster, and disposed of the haunted remains. I positively believe in the paranormal, and to this day, clocks still creep me out. I grew up in rural Minnesota, and because we were teenagers and it's easier to trespass at night when you live in a small town and all your neighbors know you, my brother and cousins and I drove to an old barn when it was dark. My cousins were too scared, so they stayed in the car, but my brother and I, we went inside. I was standing near an old water trough, and I felt a hand on my shoulder. I said, "Ben, I told you not to try to scare me." And from away across the barn, I heard Ben say, "I wasn't." Out in the corner of my eye, I saw a white hand, clear as day, on my left shoulder. I started screaming, and we both ran back to the car and drove away as fast as we could. I have always been quite receptive to ghosts and spirits. I can sense their presence very well and even communicate with them on occasion. I trace this back to a very surreal experience when I was 4 or 5 years old. I lived in a house built in the early 1900s, and my room had 2 twin beds. I slept in one, and the other one was for guests. I had always slept in the same bed by the door, but one night I wanted to switch things up a little bit, and decided to sleep in the other bed. My parents woke me up the next morning to find my legs covered in blood. They searched my body for cuts or bites, and even searched the house for animals. They never figured out where the blood had come from. I never slept in that bed again. From that night on, for a few years, I had severe night terrors. Apparently, I screamed in my sleep with my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. My parents would rouse me, and I have no memory of what just happened. And from then on, I've had a connection to the paranormal world. I used to be a nanny during the summer.